You know, when Boeing announced the 787, they called it the Dreamliner. It was supposed to be this incredible, revolutionary leap forward in air travel. But that dream, well, it pretty quickly turned into one of the most legendary failures in modern manufacturing history. It's an amazing story of ambition, a complete operational collapse, and a lesson that wound up costing billions and billions of dollars. So let's get into it. Let's break down how this whole thing went so completely off the rails. Okay, first things first. Let's just put the final price tag up. The original budget for developing this plane was somewhere around $7 billion. Sounds like a lot, right? Well, the final cost for the program? $32 billion. That's not just a budget overrun, that's a whole other category of financial disaster.
And believe me, it wasn't just about the money, not by a long shot. The project was also 40 months behind schedule. 40! I mean, in the airline industry, where every single day a plane is on the ground it's losing money, 40 months is an eternity. The Dreamliner was very quickly becoming a nightmare.
So you have to ask the question, right? How does this even happen? We are talking about Boeing. For decades, the undisputed gold standard in aerospace. How did they completely lose control of their most important project in a generation? Well, the answer comes down to one massive and, as it turns out, catastrophic bet.
And that brings us to the absolute core of the story, the great outsourcing bet. See, Boeing was in a dogfight with their rival Airbus, and they needed to slash costs. So they decided to radically change the way they built airplanes, and that decision would have consequences they never, ever saw coming.
The plan was for Boeing to basically transform itself. They decided they weren't really going to be a manufacturer anymore. Nope, they were going to become a system integrator. And what does that mean? It means their job wasn't to, build the wings and the fuselage anymore. Their job was just to manage all the other companies around the world who were building them. The plan, on paper, looked great. Boeing sends out the specs, and then at the very end, they just kind of snap it all together like a giant Lego set. Simple, right?
And the scale of this bet was just staggering. I mean, look at this. A full 70% of the 787, not just the manufacturing, but the actual design work, was outsourced. This was completely unprecedented. We're talking more than 50 major partners, each responsible for building a huge, critical section of the aircraft.
This map really gives you a sense of the sheer complexity. You've got the wings coming from Japan, key parts of the fuselage from Italy, the wingtips from South Korea. It's like you decided to build a house and you hired 50 different contractors, but they're all in different countries, none of them speak the same language, and they might not all be working from the same blueprints. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? Well, the answer to what could possibly go wrong turned out to be pretty much everything. That brilliant, ambitious plan on paper, it devolved into absolute chaos on the factory floor. And this is where the dream really began to completely unravel.
And the problems started showing up immediately. For example, a key supplier in South Carolina called Vought was supposed to deliver the aft fuselage sections nearly finished, plug and play. Instead, the sections started showing up just 16% complete. They were basically empty metal tubes with almost nothing inside. From there, the problems just cascaded. They ran into a massive shortage of specialized fasteners, the high-tech bolts that actually hold the plane together. So what did they do? And I am not making this up. They literally sent people out to local hardware stores to buy temporary bolts to hold the early Dreamliners together. The plan was to replace them later, but you can imagine the insane amount of rework and damage that caused.
This all culminated in the now infamous public rollout event in 2007. Boeing had promised the world they'd show off the plane, so they had to do something. They rolled out what looked like a finished 787, but in reality, it was a total fake. It was a hollow shell with plywood doors and absolutely no engines or systems inside. It was pure theater, designed to hide a project that was in complete disarray.
All this chaos created a phenomenon the industry calls traveled work. Basically, all the unfinished jobs, all the mistakes, all the problems from the suppliers, they traveled all the way to Boeing's final assembly line. So instead of that simple 3-day snap-together process, Boeing engineers were now spending all their time just fixing other people's mistakes. They weren't an integration facility, they were the world's most expensive repair shop.
The fallout from all this wasn't just financial, and it wasn't just about delays. The systemic breakdown in design, in oversight, and in quality control was about to shift from a massive business problem to a critical threat to public safety.
First, the financial bleeding was just immense. Boeing had to pump $3.5 billion back into its own supply chain just to keep its partners from going under. And remember that Vought plant, the one sending the empty parts? Boeing had to buy it back for $580 million. Just think about that. They were forced to buy back the very control they had been so eager to give away.
But then, the problems got terrifyingly real. This quote from a passenger on a 787 that had to make an emergency landing in Japan, it just captures the human side of all this. The smoke he saw was coming from one of the plane's advanced, and it turns out very volatile, lithium-ion batteries. In January of 2013, the crisis hit its absolute peak. First, a battery catches fire on a plane just parked at the gate in Boston. Then wiring problems are reported on another jet, and then the emergency landing in Japan. Just 1 day later, the FAA took the drastic step of grounding the entire global 787 fleet for 3 months. To put that in perspective, it was the first time an entire class of aircraft had been grounded like that since 1979. This was a really big deal.
The investigation by the National Transportation Safety Board was, to put it mildly, damning. They found it wasn't just one company's fault. The NTSB spread the blame across the entire chain. They blamed the battery manufacturer for design flaws. They blamed Boeing for failing to even test for a worst-case battery meltdown. And they even blamed the FAA, the regulator, for not requiring those tests in the first place. It was a total system failure.
So after this $32 billion disaster, what's the big takeaway? It really all comes down to a fundamental lesson in business about what you should, and maybe more importantly, what you should not hand over to someone else.
This slide just puts it in such stark contrast. On the left, you have the traditional Boeing. They designed the parts, they built the parts, they own the intellectual property. Then look at the right. For the 787, they gave all of that away. They basically demoted themselves from being the architect and the builder to just being a referee in a game where their partners owned everything that mattered: the designs, the processes, and all the critical expertise.
It took years, but eventually Boeing's own leadership had to admit they made a huge mistake. This quote from Jim Alba, who was running commercial airplanes at the time, is a direct acknowledgement that the whole strategy failed. When he says we are going back to our roots, he's really saying we have to get back to being an engineering company that actually builds things.
And that leaves us with this final critical question. Boeing thought that by outsourcing, they were reducing their financial risk, sharing the cost. But what they really did was outsource their core competency, their deep institutional knowledge of how to design and build an airplane. And when you do that, you find out very quickly that you're not reducing risk, you are multiplying it across a global supply chain that you can no longer control. And that is a powerful $32 billion lesson for any business.